Thank you very much. It looks like we've got a full house here tonight, and I'm not surprised because this really is an extraordinary story. I don't know how many people have actually read the book. Maybe if we just got some sort of sense of how many have read the book, we'll know more or less how to kind of pitch it. Great. Okay, that's decent. Small but decent. It's my great pleasure to introduce two people who I think have really gone a long way to putting a human face on what is probably one of the least reported crimes against humanity of the last 50 years. It's been an extremely difficult story for journalists to get hold of. These are hidden camps, hidden away in the mountains of North Korea. Shin Dong-Hyuk was born in one of these camps to what promised to be effectively a life of slave labor, no prospect of getting out. Somehow he managed to escape, get out, and tell his story to the world. Blaine Harden here was the journalist who found that story and put in the time and the persistence and the energy and the writing ability to bring this story to a wider audience. We've been hearing an awful lot about North Korea in the last few months, last few weeks. It was the death of the dictator, the succession process, the launching of the missile. Now there's a lot of rhetoric about North Korea planning to detonate a nuclear bomb, threats going backwards and forwards across the demilitarized zone. In the middle of all of that, a report came out which was very little reported. It was called The Hidden Gulag, and it is the most authoritative document so far that catalogues what is going on, what's really happening in these hidden camps where something like 150 to 200,000 people are slaving away, often under life terms. This report was an updated version of one that came out 10 years ago, but in the intervening 10 years, there are now many more people who've escaped from prison camps in North Korea who are in South Korea, and the researchers are getting much more access to them. A man called David Hawk produced that report. It got very little coverage, and that's really the story of North Korea. Every time anyone wants to push forward the question of human rights, everything gets distracted by missile threats and nuclear threats. This is the experience the Americans have had, the British have had, the Europeans have had when they've tried to put North Korea onto the agenda. I think that the work that Mr. Shin and Blaine have done really helps to get this onto the agenda. People have to take notice of this story of extraordinary brutality and hardship. I'm going to hand over to Blaine, who's going to give a quick introduction with some slides. Then Mr. Shin will talk for about 10 minutes. I'll put a couple of questions, and then there's lots of people here. Most of it will all be open to the floor for questions. So Blaine, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, what I'd like to do is to try to give you a sense of what the camps are for and what kind of state North Korea is that it needs camps. So it'll be a very quick primer on totalitarianism in North Korea. Let me just go through these quickly. Totalitarian states don't last very long. Those are the numbers, except for North Korea. One of the reasons is the camps. The government there has lost none of its appetite for hideous cruelty. They are as cruel now as they've ever been. And that's not true in other totalitarian states. How many states have survived a change of leadership? Only North Korea. And they've done it twice. And this is the hit parade of the great and dear leaders. And the young general, Kim Jong-un, is now in charge. He happens to be about the same age as Mr. Shin Dong-Hyuk, which is an interesting coincidence. They actually are the antipodes of the world in North Korea. One individual who was born above the law, educated partially in Switzerland, where he followed Michael Jordan and played point guard, and then went back to Pyeongan and did who knows what until he became a 4-star general without any military experience. And then his dad died, and he became what has been described as a gift from heaven for the country. Mr. Shin was born below the law. His crime, in fact, was to have been born in this camp, for which he received a life sentence of hard labor. The camps, according to the North Korean government, do not exist, and he does not exist, according to any laws that are known in North Korea. And how does North Korea hang on so long? Well, there are 4 or 5 pillars of any totalitarian state. Control of the economy is usually one of them. That has collapsed in North Korea. The state-controlled economy fell apart in the 90s after the disappearance of the Soviet Union. The economy now is a scruffy set of street markets. And that's how most people find food in North Korea. The stranglehold on information is still considerable in North Korea, but that too is breaking down because of a semi-permeable border with China. CDs, DVDs, USB fobs, small radios, 20 to 30% of the population of North Korea is estimated by American intelligence to be listening regularly to some sort of foreign radio now. So there's a lot more intelligence, there's a lot more understanding of how the world works inside North Korea at this point than there ever has been. The other legs of totalitarianism, though, however, are very strong. The secret police is huge, pervasive, and it's now making a living by extracting rents from the street markets. If you operate as a trader in the markets anywhere in the country, you very often have to pay off the police. And if you don't pay off the police, they've actually, in the past 5 years, according to defectors, constructed a new set of prisons. And those prisons will take someone from the market to a nearby prison. Usually it's a distance of a couple miles. It's a very informal prison where they will do 2 things. They'll either beat the hell out of you or let you watch somebody else experience that. And then they'll ask for money. And if you don't give them money, then they might kill you. This is according to recent testimony of defectors moving into China and into South Korea. So the secret police is actually living off of the street markets. That's how they get a lot of their salary. And then the camps. The camps have remained a very important part of the totalitarian state. Not because there are so many people in them. 23, 24 million people in North Korea, between 135 and 200,000 people in the camps. There are now 5 camps. And the camps have lasted so much longer than these style of camps ever have anywhere else in the world. You can see the chart. What the camps do is they don't put away so many people, is that they neutralize, isolate, and eventually eliminate anybody who is thought to be an opponent of the regimes, anyone who is just perceived to be a wrong thinker. That's the language that David Hawk uses in his most recent book. But their real purpose is to scare the hell out of everybody else in the country. Because the way they work is if you are perceived to be a criminal, a political opponent, you go to the prison along with your kids and your parents. David Hawk and other investigators of the camps estimate that about half the people in the camps are there simply because they're related to somebody who is perceived to be a wrongdoer. So they are an instrument of terror, and they have worked very well. What has the West done about the camps? I've talked at considerable length with 2 American diplomats who've been involved in more than 2 decades worth of negotiations with the North Koreans. Secret meetings, public meetings. And what have they said about the camps to the North Korean diplomats? They've tried to bring up the camps, and if they do, the Koreans go nuts and leave the room, and Americans basically drop it. I talked to a diplomat, a career diplomat who's recently left the State Department, and he was just ashamed of American performance on this issue. They don't talk about it. It's not been a subject of any real negotiations with North Korea or with China, North Korea's patron and supporter. Part of it is that North Korea is a real military threat. Besides being a totalitarian state that's really cruel to its own people, they have old muscle, but real muscle that is a real threat to Seoul. Seoul is one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, about 20 to 25 million people, however you count it. Almost all of Seoul is within range of artillery that the North Koreans have lined up near the DMZ. The CIA estimates that within 10 minutes, if North Korea decides to pull the trigger, they can kill 10 to hundreds of thousands of people in Seoul. And there's absolutely nothing that can be done about it. The artillery is dug in. North Korea would lose a war, but the cost to Seoul would be catastrophic in terms of casualties. And this is one of the reasons why South Korea is so tolerant of intermittent craziness by the North Koreans. They have sunk ships, they have shelled islands, they have sent commandos down the main street of Seoul to try to kill the president. They've landed a submarine and sent commandos through the cities and streets of South Korea. And in effect, South Korea just says, stop it, and then forgets about it and goes on to be one of the most prosperous, wired countries in the world that just happens to have this neighbor next door with all the artillery and also missiles and nukes. Although the nukes are crude and they cannot be missilized at this point, so they're not really deliverable. So they really aren't part of the threat at this point. Yeah, I just mentioned extortion and all of this. So this is where you can see where Mr. Shin's camp, Camp 14, is basically in the center of the country in mountains. And the other camps are similarly situated. So how many people have escaped from these camps in 50 years? 3. One was a lieutenant colonel in the military. He escaped from Camp 18 about a decade ago. He got in a coal train, got covered up by some coal and under a board and got out. A few years later, another woman, a woman escaped in basically the same way from Camp 18. How many people born in the camp have escaped? As far as we know, it's Mr. Shin. And I think it's a good time to introduce Mr. Shin.
Mr. Shin, so if you give an introductory few words and then we'll go to questions.
제가 런던에는 좀 자주 오는 편이거든요.
I've been coming to London quite a few times, and it's my 4th time actually.
물론 뭐 돈 벌러 오거나 뭐 이렇게 뭐 여행하러 오는 건 절대로 아닙니다.
I don't come here to make money or to travel.
그래서 이제 이번에 왔을 때 굉장히 특별한 거는 이제 이 블레인 씨가 조에 대한 스토리를 책으로 냈기 때문에 또 이 책에 관한 일 때문에 이번에는 런던을 방문하게 됐었죠.
This time I came to have a book tour with Blaine, who wrote a book about me.
사실 4년 전에 벌써 이제 한국하고 일본에서 이제 조에 대한 스토리 제가 직접 쓴 책이 출판이 됐었습니다.
In fact, a book written by myself was published in Korea and Japan 4 years ago.
하지만 그때 제가 그 책을 내고 굉장히 제가 살고 있는 이 사회, 이 지구, 우리 땅덩어리에 굉장히 실망을 크게 했었습니다.
But At the time, I was dejected by the reception that my book had.
물론 제가 그때 썼던 책 내용이 굉장히 충격적이었었고 굉장히 끔찍했었고 사람들은 그 내용 자체를 믿기 힘들 정도로 그런 책 내용들이었었거든요.
Probably it was because the content contained the most appalling and horrendous accounts that people found it very difficult to believe.
물론 그 책을 보고 북한 인권에 관심을 가져주신 분들도 계셨고 또 거의 대부분의 사람들은 그냥 호기심에 저 사람이 수용소에서 살다 나왔기 때문에 궁금해서 한번 만나나 보자 뭐 이런 분위기였었던 거죠.
There were a few people who took genuine interest in my story, but most of them bought my book just out of curiosity.
제가 이제 물론 기자들도 마찬가지였었어요. 그냥 책이 나왔다고 하니까 궁금해서 한번 취재나 해보자 이런 정도로 그냥 저를 취재를 했었고 취재를 했어도 그냥 제가 하고 싶은 얘기, 제가 마음을 담아서 전하려고 했던 메시지들은 전혀 나오질 않았고 그냥 기자들이 입맛에 맞게 뉴스를 내보내는 정도였었죠.
It was the same with the reporters. They met me out of curiosity. But they didn't really get the real message that I wanted to deliver. They just made articles sensational.
그러다가 저는 이제 2008년에 처음 이제 제가 처음으로 외국이라고 이제 나왔는데 그게 이제 워싱턴 DC에 미국 워싱턴 DC에 처음 이제 오게 됐었습니다.
In 2008, I had my first ever overseas trip. Outside of Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and China, of course, and it was in Washington D.C.
그때 제가 워싱턴 D.C. 와서 가장 처음으로 가봤던 게 홀로코스트 뮤지엄이었었거든요.
And the very first place I visited was the Holocaust Museum.
그때 제가 가서 홀로코스트 뮤지엄에서 그 마지막에 이제 미군이 들어가서 이제 이 나치 수용소를 이제 점령하고 나서 그 참상 많은 사람들이 죽은 모습 그걸 보고 제가 그걸 이제 보게 됐었습니다.
There I saw images of dead bodies, bodies of those who died in Nazi concentration camps.
여러분들 아마 잘 알고 계시라고 저도 생각을 하고 있습니다.
I'm sure you know very well about the Holocaust and the Nazi concentration camps.
거기서 가장 충격받았던 장면이 나치 수용소에 미군이 들어갔을 때에 그 수많은 시체들을 불도저로 밀어서 이제 땅에다 파묻는 장면이었었거든요.
The most shocking image I encountered there was when the U.S. Army went to the concentration camp, found the countless dead bodies. They just bulldozed the dead bodies and buried them.
저는 그 장면을 보면서 제가 살았던 정치범 수용소의 앞날을 상상하게 됐었어요.
And I could see the possible future of prison camps in North Korea there.
여러분들이 알고 계시는 이 대학살은 나치 수용소만이 아니죠.
There are many other genocides that people know, in addition to the Nazi concentration camps.
캄보디아 킬링필드에서 수백만 명이 벌써 죽었죠.
Millions of people died in the killing field in Cambodia.
루안다에서 많은 사람들이 삭살당했죠.
So many people died in Rwanda genocide.
수단 다르푸르에서 수많은 사람들이 학살당했죠.
And also in Darfur in Sudan.
또 코소보 이런 데서 인종 청소한다고 해서 수많은 사람들이 또 학살당했죠.
And the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans.
근데 국제사회는 왜 이렇게 큰 학살이 일어나고 나서 관심을 가져주는 거예요?
Well, why do people care only after these kind of horrendous killings have already taken place?
사람들이 죽고 나서 이렇게 대학살이 일어나고 나서 관심을 가져주는데 그게 무슨 소용이 있습니까?
What's the use after so many lives have already been lost?
대학살이 일어나고 나서 그 당사자들, 그 범죄자들을 재판한다고 해서 국제형사재판소에서 재판한다고 하는데 그게 무슨 소용이 있을까요?
Those who are to be blamed are eventually taken to the International Criminal Court and tried. But what's the use after all that has already happened?
지금까지 우리가 알았던 이 대학살 그런 참상들이 여러분들은 지나간 일이라고 지금 생각하고 있을 겁니다.
Probably many of you think the genocides have already happened and there's nothing like that going on at the moment.
저는 이 책을 통해서 지금까지 우리가 알아왔던 대학살이 끝난 게 아니라 지금도 진행되고 있는 현실이라고 저는 밝히고 싶었었어요.
What I wanted to say through this book was that there is a genocide and massive killings still going on in the world.
많은 사람들이 제가 한국에서 이미 전에 썼던 내 책 내용을 보고 저게 정말일까? 저게 거짓말이다. 저게 사실일까? 이게 의문점 드는 사람들도 많았었고요.
Many people questioned whether my story, the book that I wrote 4 years ago, that was true.
국제사회에서 이런 의문을 품고 이렇게 있는 사이에 벌써 북한에서는 수백만 명이 굶어 죽었습니다. 벌써.
While the international community is doubting whether my stories are true or not, there were millions of people who died in North Korea and who are also dying at the moment.
그것도 모자라서 지금 정치범 수용소에 지금 공식적으로는 20만 명의 지금 정치범 죄수들이 갇혀 있다고 하는데 그 사람들도 죽기를 지금 기다리고 있는 사람들이죠.
And the official figure says there are about 200,000 people imprisoned in prison camps in North Korea, and they are waiting for their death.
제가 이 자리에서 내 스토리에 대해서 이렇게 말씀드리지는 않겠습니다. 책을 보시면은 북한 여러분들이 믿든 안 믿든 이 북한사의 실상을 그대로 이제 반영을 했기 때문에 여러분들이 책을 보시면은 더 잘 알리라고 저는 생각을 합니다.
This evening, I won't go into details of my experiences in the prison camp. You can see more of that in the book. And believing it or not, whether you believe it or not, it's your choice.
처음에 저는 사실 제가 여러 가지 실망했던 것 때문에 기자들을 믿지를 않았었거든요. 여러 기자들이 저한테 찾아왔어도 저는 인터뷰에 응하지도 않았었고 만나주지도 않았었습니다.
Because of the huge disappointment I felt when my own book came out in 2007, I lost trust and faith in journalists, and I always declined giving interviews to journalists.
그때게 이제 블레인 하든이 저를 한번 찾아왔었어요. 2008년도에.
But in 2008, Blaine came to me.
하지만 저는 블레인도 딱같이 이제 다른 사람들처럼 이제 믿지를 않았었거든요.
And I thought Blaine was just one of those reporters whom I couldn't trust.
그래서 저는 지금까지 제가 한국 책도 냈고 일본에서도 책을 냈고 했지만은 사람들이 관심을 가져주지 않았다. 이렇게 사람들이 관심을 가져주지 않을수록 우리 북한 사람들은 더 많이 죽어갈 것이고 정치범 수용소에 있는 사람들은 누구도 모르게 거기서 그냥 죽고 말 것이다 이렇게 얘기를 계속 하곤 했었거든요.
I told him that even after my book came out in Korea and Japan, not many people took interest in the prison camp issues in North Korea, and I want to avoid further disappointment while more people are dying.
처음에 블레인이 저한테 책을 내자고 했을 때 저는 거부를 했었어요.
So when Blaine approached me with the idea of writing a book, I declined initially.
내가 끔찍하게 살아왔던 내 일생의 스토리를 밝히기도 너무 힘들고 가슴 아프고 또 이걸 밝혀봤자 당신도 그냥 호기심에 궁금증에 그냥 나한테 왔다고 생각하기 때문에 나는 그걸 거부를 했었거든요.
I thought Blaine just came to me out of curiosity, and also it's very painful process to bring back all those painful memories.
하지만 블레인은 저를 끈질기게 설득을 하면서 블레인이 한 말이 나는 기자라는 신분을 떠나서 북한에서 일어나고 있는 실상을 자기의 글로 통해서 사람들한테 믿게 하고 또 자기의 글이 이 북한 정치범 수용소에 도움이 되게 하겠다고 저한테 약속을 했었습니다.
But Blaine was persistent, and he persuaded me that regardless of his occupation as a reporter, he wanted to raise awareness about the prison camp situation in North Korea, and he promised that through his writing he will help bring changes to North Korean human rights situation.
여러분, 저는 이제 여러분들한테 이제 꼭 한 가지 좀 말씀드리고 싶어요.
I would like to, out of all this, I would like to deliver this message to you.
그냥 이 책을 통해서 그냥 사실 지금 제가 살았던 정치범 수용소의 상황을 봤을 때는 그 안에 살고 있는 수십만 명의 정치범 죄수들이 그냥 안전하게 나올 수 있는 가능성이 전혀 없거든요.
I think there is a very slim chance that hundreds of thousands of people who are confined, who are jailed in prison camps, can safely escape from prison camps in North Korea.
그냥 제 바람은 여러분들이 블레인 씨가 쓴 저 정치범 수용소에 관한 책을 읽으시고 훗날에 북한 정치범 수용소에서 이런 대학살이 일어났을 때에 여러분들은 이 책 내용을 통해서 그들을 기억만 해주신다고 하게 되면 저는 더 바랄 게 없어요.
I'm not very optimistic, but my hope is that if genocide happens, if massive killings happen in prison camps in North Korea, but if you have read the book, please remember them in your memory in the future.
그렇지 않으면은 그냥 지금 북한에 있는 북한 국민들이나 정치범 수용소에서 살고 있는 사람들이 딱 한 가지 잘하는 게 있습니다.
There is one thing that people in prison camps in North Korea can do very well.
바로 죽는 거 하나는 너무나도 잘해요.
It's dying.
그 사람들이 그냥 벌써 수백만 명이 굶어 죽어도 아무 말 못하고 그냥 그 안에서 살고 있고.
Already so many people have died of starvation without being able to resist the regime.
정치범 수용소에서 수십만 명이 살면서 아무 죄 없이 거기에 들어가서 살면서 또 그 안에서 아무 죄 없이 애들이 태어나고 있는데도 자기가 왜 여기서 갇혀 있어야 되는지도 모르고 그냥 거기 안에서 죽고 있거든요.
There are so many people dying without knowing why they ended up in prison camps, and also those who were born there.
그래서 저는 여러분들한테 이렇게 호소하고 싶은 게 우리가 이 나치 수용소, 캄보디아 킬링필드나 여러 가지 코소보 대학사 아니면 이런 여러 가지 다르푸르 사태 같은 거 기억하신다고 하게 되면은 이번만큼은 우리 국제사회가 힘을 합쳐가지고 북한에서 일어나려고 하는 이 대학살을 한 번쯤은 막아낼 수 있지 않나 하는 저는 희망을 가지고 있습니다.
My wish is that maybe this time the international community can prevent further genocide from happening, unlike the Nazi concentration camps, the Balkan ethnic cleansing, and the Darfur.
Okay, thank you very much. There's one question that occurred to me while reading the book, and that was while you were growing up in the camp, while you were a child in the camp, you said that the guards or the teachers at the school who were guards told you that you could redeem yourself by working away the sins of your family because you were born in the camp, but someone in your extended family had committed a crime against the state. Were they holding out the prospect that there could be some sort of release? Was there a possibility that you could be released at some point, or was it made clear to you from the beginning that there would be no way out?
책에서 보면 너가 자랄 때 가족의 너가 열심히 일을 하면 가족의 죄를 씻을 수 있다고 그렇게 항상 배운다고 하는데 거기 너가 만약에 일을 열심히 하면 언젠가는 풀려나올 수 있을 거란 희망을 줬는지 아니면 참전을 거기서
일단 제가 태어나서 그 관리소에서 이제 처음으로 배운 게 이 간수가 저한테 가르쳐 주길, 어린 아이들 앉혀놓고 가르쳐 주길, 너네들은 죽지 못해서 살려준 사람들이다.
The first thing that I remember being taught by the prison guards / teacher was that we were supposed to be dead long time ago, but we were very lucky to have been granted another chance to live.
너희 부모들이 죄를 짓고 이 안에 수용소에서 들어와서 살고 또 너 죄를 지은 부모 밑에서 자식으로 태어났기 때문에 너희들은 그 부모들이 죄를 씻기 위해서 열심히 일을 해야 한다.
And because your parents are criminals and you were born from them, you have to redeem yourself and the sin of your family by working hard.
부모들이 죄를 씻기 위해서 열심히 일을 하면은 이 죄가 없어지고 거기서 바깥으로 나올 수 있다는 희망은 전혀 가져본 적이 없습니다.
I personally had no hope that there might be a day when I would be released, despite all the hard labor.
우리가 하루하루 우리가 생각해야 되는 거는 그 안에서 어떻게 하나 죽지 말고 어떻게 하나 간수들이 우리한테 맡겨준 일을 열심히 해야 마치는 것만이 우리가 해야 될 일이라고 저는 생각을 했죠.
The only thing that I always cared and worried about was meeting the quota, doing the work that guards gave me without making mistakes, and surviving basically a day on a daily basis.
수용소에서 만든 법에도 수용소에서 이제 만든 이 죄수들이 지켜야 하는 법에도 간수의 말을 조금이라도 어겼을 경우 가차없이 청산한다고 이렇게 명시되어 있기 때문에 우리는 그런 속에서 우리는 무슨 살아날 수 있다는 희망 자체를 생각해 본 적이 전혀 없습니다.
I couldn't think of any hope when the rules in the prison camp says you can be mercilessly shot to death by guards if you don't follow the order.
Did they give any explanation about what the context was, about where you were, about the wider life in North Korea and the outside world, or was it just a world unto itself?
다른 너의 처음 상황을 북한 나라의 다른 더 큰 배경을 설명하는지 너의 상황을 설명해줬는지 아니면 그냥 수용소 삶에 대해서만밖에 못 배웠는지.
일단 그 수용소 안에서 태어났다고 할 때 제 경험으로 놓고 봤을 때는 그 수용소 안에서 태어나면은 딱 같은 죄수였어요. 특별히 뭘 가르쳐주지 않아도 눈으로 보고 우리가 느낄 수 있었기 때문에 그냥 총을 들고 저렇게 우리를 일시키는 사람은 간수고 또 죄수복을 입고 힘들게 일하는 사람들은 저렇게 평생을 이 안에서 저렇게 살다가 죽어야 되는 사람들이다. 우리는 그걸 운명으로 받아들였습니다.
Because I was born there, it didn't take a long time for me to realize that I'm one of the criminals in uniform, and the ones with guns are prison guards, and my fate was to live a life of criminal forever.
그 외에 뭐 수용소 밖에 대한 상황이라든지 그거에 대해서는 전혀 배운 적이 없고 그때 당시 내 생각으로는 내가 밟고 있는 땅 전체가 다 간수하고 죄수로만 구분이 되는 사회인 줄 알고 있었죠.
I was never taught about the life outside of prison camp ever, and the world in my thought was consisted only of prison guards and prisoners.
Let's open it up, and obviously, questions can come either to Mr. Shin or to Blaine or to both. There's a question over here.
My name is Betsy Kawamura, and I met Mr. Shin 1.5 years ago, and I'm also in touch with several of the diaspora community here. And I have a question. It could be a little bit sensitive, but with my
Speak up.
oh, okay, with my conversation with some of the diaspora groups, I understand that there were higher level guards who escaped and sought asylum in different countries, and my defector colleagues or friends felt that this was rather unfairness in a philosophical way, because they themselves were prisoners and they escaped or basically they sought asylum and defected, and yet they see these high ranking or privileged guards who also escaped, who are getting equal treatment, equal good quality treatment when they defect to the West. I mean, how does he see this? I mean, do you feel any anger towards the guards who were released, and how do you deal with this, if so?
탈북은 힘든 사람들은 아니고 계급이 똑같은 북한에서 그런 사람들이 나와가지고 서방생이 나와서 똑같이 난민지를 받고 좋은 대접을 받고 있는데 난민으로서의 지혜타를 받고 있는데 그 안에서도 혜택을 받았던 계급 사람들이 나와서 똑같이 대접을 받게 돼서 너는 어떻게 생각해? 화가 나는지.
뭐 거기에 대해서는 전혀 생각해 본 적이 없고요. 또 이 나름대로 거기 무슨 북한에서도 높은 지위에 있던 사람들이 거기 북한을 탈출했을 때는 다 이유가 있다고 생각을 하기 때문에 거기에 대해서 무슨 뭐 여러 가지 뭐 의문 좀 가져본 적은 전혀 없습니다. 그냥 거기서 잘 살다가 탈출을 했던 아니면 뭐 힘들게 살다가 저처럼 탈출했던지 간에 그냥 저희가 생각하는 목적은 이 북한에서 일어나고 있는 이 정말 말도 안 되는 현실을 우리가 힘을 합쳐서 바꾸자고 하는 데 목적이 있기 때문에 뭐 그렇게 뭐 잘 살다가 탈출했던 사람이라고 해도 저랑 생각이 같다고 저는 믿고 있습니다.
I never thought of it in that way, and even though I met people who had relatively who held high ranks in the in North Korea and had comfortable and privileged life there, I believe that they had their own reasons for escape and leaving North Korea, and no matter what your life was like in North Korea, I believe our shared goal, common goal, is to bring end to that ridiculous system in North Korea. So my perspective is from that angle. We have shared goal towards which we have to work together.
Yes, one over here.
So
Okay, sure.
I'm just interested in how long it took to write the book, and also how did you deal with such harrowing material when you were writing it, in your writing process? Did you try to retain a sort of professional detachment, or did you feel sometimes quite overwhelmed by how harrowing it all was to hear?
Well, it is an awful story, and so, but just listening to a story is what we do, journalists, and so it wasn't difficult in that respect. What was difficult with Mr. Shin was to get him to tell me the story in all its detail, because it's so painful for him, and because he grew up not trusting anyone, especially his parents. I think I should explain a bit about his story. He was basically raised by the guards and not by his parents. There are two things that are new with what Shin has told the world about his life in the camps. There's now been about 60 people who've been in the camps who come and talk to human rights investigators and to journalists, including a handful of guards and basically they all tell exactly the same story. The conditions in the camps, the near starvation diet, the very, very long work days, the early death, usually of malnutrition-related diseases, around the age of 45 to 50. Many people hunch over because of vitamin deficiencies in their diet, and they die early. So the general picture of the hideous squalor and misery in these camps is well known. What Shin has provided is two bits of information. His parents were selected by the guards to breed. And he was bred very much like a farm animal to be a slave in the camp. This information was new. It's new to the investigators. And what he knows about the outside world, or what he knew before he escaped and before he met somebody who had come in from the outside to the camp, was nothing. He'd been raised by the guards very deliberately not to know anything, so that he would be compliant, and He was so compliant, in fact, and this is the pivotal event in his early life. When he was 13 years old, he went home he lived at that point in a boarding school, but just a couple blocks from the building where his mother slept. He was allowed to go home one Friday night when he was 13 years old, and on that night his older brother happened to be there as well. They ate their usual dinner, the same dinner he'd eaten every night of his life for 23 years, actually the same meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, corn, cabbage, and a bit of salt. Then he went to sleep. He was awakened around midnight to hear his mother and brother talking. He heard the word escape. The rules of the first rule of the camp is, if you try to escape, you will be shot immediately. If you hear anybody talking about escape and fail to report it, you will be shot immediately. These were like the 10 commandments that he memorized when he was a toddler. He heard this discussion about escape. His heart started to pound. He got very, very anxious and afraid. And he got up, told his mom he had to go to the bathroom. He left the room and went out and found a classmate. He walked back to his school, found a classmate, and said, "What should I do?" They decided to report his mother and brother, which they did. The next morning, his mother and brother were taken to an underground prison inside the camp, where they stayed for 7 months. But Shin was arrested the next morning as well. The guard that he'd snitched to, did not tell his superiors that he got the information from Shin. So Shin was taken to that underground camp as a suspected collaborator in an escape plan. There he was tortured over a fire when he was 13 years old, and before he was so frightened and confused, before he could tell the guards in that prison that he was the person who'd snitched, who'd had done a good job, in his words, he was tortured, and finally he got it out, that he'd been the person who turned it in. They checked with that classmate that he'd spoken to that night, and they confirmed his story, and so they allowed him to live. 7 months later, the family was taken to the camp execution grounds, a place that he'd first gone when he was 4 years old to watch somebody get shot. They took him back to this place along with his father, who'd also been brought into that camp. But Shin and his father wore blindfolds until they got to the execution grounds. They got there, most of the camp was assembled, as they always did for executions. They took off Shin's blindfold, and he thought, they're going to kill me. But in fact, they didn't. They took him and his father to the front of the crowd and brought out his mother and his brother and took them to the front and hanged his mother and shot his brother in front of him. When his mother was hanged, she tried to catch his eye, and he refused to look at her. He was angry with her because he felt that she had betrayed him by talking about escape, by violating the camp rules, by violating the only code of behavior that he'd ever knew. And when she was killed, and when his brother was killed, he felt no guilt for having snitched on them. That was not a relevant concept in his cosmology of being a human being. Only after he got out, 10 years later, and only in the past 6 years has he tried to absorb this lesson of the kind of child he was and what he did with his mother. So that is his story, and this is a story of a dehumanization, a systematic dehumanization of people who are bred to be slaves that Shin brings to the world that no one else has told. And that is what makes his story so powerful. And yes, in fact, I choke up when I talk about it. When I wrote that part of the book, it was extremely difficult because it gets inside you and it eats at you. And he's lived with it. He does not cry about it, but he has begun to understand it. And it's a great tribute to his intelligence and his emotional capacity for growth.
But that was a story that he wasn't able to tell to anyone else until you'd built up trust with him over a long period.
Is this story about the betrayal of his family was something that he'd lived with. When he escaped and got to China and then got to South Korea, he did not want to tell people in South Korea that he had betrayed his family. He thought, his language was, they would think me not to be a human being. So he didn't mention it. And he didn't mention it in his book. And he didn't mention it in interviews with reporters. And he didn't mention it to me when I wrote a front page story in the Washington Post that got a tremendous amount of attention and that made me want to do the book. I was utterly surprised when he told me in August of 2010, and we were in the middle of our third or fourth week of day-long interviews, and he said, there's something I have to tell you. And he actually wanted to tell the director of the human rights group that he was working with at the time to come and listen to this interview. He said that I'm now surrounded by people I trust. I'm surrounded by people who care about me, and I can't live with this lie. And I said, what lie? And then he said that he was the one who, he described himself as one of the mean people in the camp who would betray others to obey the rules and also to get more food. And it made sense to me. It helped make his story cohered better after he told me that. There's one other thing I think I should mention. Corroborating the stories of the people who come out of the camps in a typical journalistic way. You go to the camps, you talk to the guards, you talk to the other people in the camp. You build a story from the ground up, and you have this wonderful, you can't do that. The North Koreans don't allow you to go. No one has gone into these camps other than guards, some officials of the government, and people who go there to work until they die. So you can't do it that way. With Mr. Shin's story, the way I corroborated it was 3 or 4 different ways. His body is a map of the story he tells. He was burned on his back when he was 13. There are terrible scars on his back and buttocks. His legs are terribly scarred from electrical burns from when he escaped through an electric fence when he was 23. His middle finger is cut off. When he dropped a sewing machine and he was punished, they cut it off with a knife at the first knuckle. He has scars around his ankles. It's basically there to see on his body. And there are now 60 people who tell virtually identical stories to the ones that he tells about life in the camp. And the human rights investigators have interviewed Shin in depth and compared his accounts to those of others. And they are very much convinced that he is consistent with everybody else, except he goes deeper because he was born in the camps. And now the high-resolution images of the camp that keep coming in have been annotated by most of the survivors. So, and in Shin's case, you can go on your smartphone when you leave here tonight and look up Camp 14 and see an annotated version of the camp where the events of his life occurred. And I spent a lot of time with Google Earth watching the contours of the camp and seeing where he moved and where these things happened. So that's as good as you can do in terms of confirmation.
Yep. Okay.
It's been very moving listening to what everyone has said this evening. I just wanted to ask, Mr. Shin was talking about ending this ridiculous country, this ridiculous society, as he put it. I wonder what he thinks, and Blaine, what you think the international community can do and what the international community should do. And also whether either of you believe that there will be a time, whether there's hope, that there will be a time that you can go there, that there will be democracy or some better form of government there, which will make it a freer society.
끝날 때 그 말도 안 되는 정권을 그렇게 끝을 내기 위해서 국제사회가 같이 같이 협동을 나갔는데 국제사회가 어떤 일을 할 수 있을지 너의 생각 그리고 너는 북한이 민주화가 됐거나 그런 날일 거라고 생각을 하는지 언제라도.
일단 그냥 저는 그냥 여러분들한테 제가 살았던 스토리를 여러분들한테 말씀드리고 그냥 제 얘기를 들은 여러분들한테 이 답이 있다고 생각을 합니다.
I think my job is to share my life story, and the real answer is in your hands. Those who heard my story.
제가 그 답은 저도 몰라요.
Because I don't know the right answer to that question.
하지만 국제사회 여러분들 눈앞에서 어떤 끔찍한 일들이 예전에도 일어났고 지금도 일어나는 거 여러분들은 잘 알고 계시잖아요.
But you know that these unimaginable, horrendous things have happened in the past, and therefore it can happen, and it is actually happening now.
여러분들은 그 끔찍한 일들을 보면서 믿기지 않은 그 일들을 보면서 눈물을 흘렸을 거고 또 무슨 생각을 하셨을 겁니다.
And learning about these atrocities of humankind, you must have felt something, or maybe that kind of history made you cry.
여러분들이 그 눈물을 흘리면서 생각했던 그 머릿속에 답이 있다고 저는 생각을 해요.
I think those emotions that you felt when you learned about these events, the answer is in those emotions.
아쉽게도 저는 해결할 수 있는 그 답은 저는 모릅니다. 그냥 여러분들한테 이 답을 찾아달라고 그냥 요구할 뿐입니다.
Unfortunately, I don't know the right answer, and I ask you to come up with a good and the best answer possible.
그리고 저는 북한 사회에 민주주의를 원하지는 않아요.
And in fact, it's not democracy that I want to be established in North Korea in the future.
자유를 원합니다, 저는.
Rather, it's freedom.
제가 봤을 때 민주주의는 독재자도 민주주의를 한다고 그러고 그냥 이 일반 이 나라에서도 민주주의를 한다고 그러거든요.
Because everyone says they are doing democracy, including the dictators.
북한도 자기네도 민주주의를 한다고 그럽니다.
North Korean dictator too.
저는 이 민주주의를 믿지 못하겠습니다.
So I don't have much trust in democracy.
그래서 저게 원하는 것은 자유.
So it's rather freedom that I want.
Any thoughts on that, Blaine?
My thoughts are very similar to his. It's an impossible country, an impossible situation. They hold real leverage, military leverage, and the perception is that they'll use it if threatened. So that's a real problem, and they've used this leverage for a long time. However, I think the purpose of this book, the purpose of Mr. Shin going through the misery of talking to me for a couple years, is to raise awareness, to plant his story in the hearts of as many people as possible in the entire world, so that when North Korea is discussed, people don't fall back on three things. Silly big hair, big glasses, funny suits, goose-stepping, ridiculous people, or nuclear weapons or missiles. They understand that at the very heart of this government, and at the reason for its longevity, is this willingness to be barbarous with its own population, and to do that without end, so that they can survive. And that's an important bit of understanding that I think has been missing. And that's the goal of this book.
The Americans did put human rights on the agenda once when they were going into talks with the North Koreans. They said, and then we want to get to human rights. And number one on the list was nuclear, and they never got beyond nuclear. When the British established diplomatic relations with North Korea, a British junior Foreign Office minister was visiting Pyongyang, and he was in talks with foreign ministry officials, and he took some of the satellite pictures from Google Earth or whatever it was of the camps, And he put them down on the table and said, what are you going to do about that? And after that, the North Koreans stopped talking to the British. When the South Koreans mention it, the North Koreans say, you're talking about regime change, and then they start threatening all sorts of retribution. So it's something that the North Koreans really don't want to talk about.
Hi there, sorry, I've got the mic, so I'll ask a question. It's a question for both of you, really. Obviously, it's really difficult for any of us to imagine what it's really like to be in that situation. I just wanted to know, even with the kind of level of obedience that is kind of instilled in everyone in the camps, is there any type or forms of dissent that you could describe? And I'm not kind of imagining mass riots or anything, but even on a kind of smaller scale, if there's any actions that people, both prisoners and guards, do that kind of goes against what they should be doing. And that leads on to a second question, which is how kind of uniformly are rules enforced? And what I'm trying to get at is obviously the whole system is inherently built on corruption from the top down, but is it kind of uneven? Do lower level guards go against what their superiors tell them to kind of gain, certain privileges and advantages? So it was just, if you could shed any more light on the kind of more very kind of minute details of the camps, that would be really interesting.
실제로 일어나는지, 두 번째 문제는 얼마나 규율들이 일괄적으로 다 모든 데서 똑같이 적용되는지, 아니면 이런 시스템은 보통 부정부패가 있기 마련이니까 부정부패로서 어느 정도 빠져나올 수 있는 부분이
물론 일단 제가 살던 이 정치범 수용소에서 제 개인적인 경험으로는 내가 왜 이렇게 살아야 되는지, 내가 왜 이 수용소 안에서 살다가 죽어야 되는지에 대한 의문점이나 억울함이라는 건 전혀 느껴본 적이 없었습니다.
In my personal case, I never felt resentful about the way I had to live. I never thought there could be another way of life there.
근데 이제 일반적인 북한 사회에서는 지금 거의 한 수십 년 동안 사람들이 굶어 죽고 먹을 게 없고 계속 굶주리고 있기 때문에 개별적인 불만들은 가지고 있지만은 역시 이 정치범 수용소를 비롯한 여러 가지 이 공포적인 그런 억압 때문에 함부로 이렇게 자기 그런 억울함을 표출 못하고 있는 상황이라고 저는 알고 있고요.
But generally speaking, even though each individual can feel dissatisfaction with the regime, because of the various apparatus that the regime used to rule over its people through fear, it's very difficult to rise up against the barbaric regime.
최근에는 북한에서 이제 노골적으로 이 대한민국하고 국제사회에 자기들이 그 통치자인 그 김정은이를 하늘처럼 높게 존경하라고 이렇게 강압적으로 요구를 하고 있거든요.
And with the recent regime change, North Korea is more vocal in demanding South Korea and the international community to recognize Kim Jong-un as its legitimate leader.
여러분들도 혹시라도 북한에 가보신 분들 계실지 모르겠지만은 외국 사람들 여러분들도 북한에 가시면은 북한에서는 강압적으로 김정일 사진이나 이런 그런 영상 앞에서 머리 숙여서 인사하게 만들고 이런 것들도 아마 여러분들은 아실 거라고 저는 생각을 합니다.
I don't know how many of you may have actually visited North Korea, but all the foreign tourists who come to North Korea, they have to pay tribute to massive statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il.
그리고 이제 저는 이런 북한의 이런 여러 가지 요구들을 저는 굉장히 거부하고 있거든요. 지금 제가 믿고 있는 건 오직 하늘에 계신 하나님밖에 없기 때문에 저는 이런 여러 가지 이런 북한에서 말도 안 되는 이 김정은에 대해서 요구하는 것에 대해서는 저는 철저하게 거부를 하고 있고 또 앞으로도 계속 반대를 하고 있을 겁니다.
Of course, I reject various demands that North Korea makes to South Korea and to the wider world, and because now I believe only in God, I resist in my own capacity the North Korean regime.
네, 그리고 이제 두 번째로는 수용산에서 규율 말하는 거죠.
그러니까 북한에서 그렇게 물론 법이라는 게 있지만 이런 북한 나라 같은 나라에서는 부정부패가 일어나기 마련인데 그게 얼마나 세게 규율이 적용돼요?
그냥 간단한 실례로 하는 말씀 드릴 텐데 이거 책에도 나와 있는 내용입니다.
I'll give you an example that's written in the book as well.
제가 수용소를 탈출하고 나서 거의 한 달이라는 시간 동안을 이 북한을 이렇게 보는 기회가 있었었거든요.
I spent about a month in North Korea outside of prison camp before I left for China.
그러고 나서 거의 마지막 때에 이제 국경에 도착하게 됩니다. 저는.
And I arrived at the border, the North Korean and Chinese border.
근데 그때게 이제 국경을 이제 쭉 걸어 올라가면서 그때게 이 국경 수비대한테서 거의 한 7번 정도를 단속 받았던 적이 있어요.
And when I was walking, while I was walking along the border, I was stopped by the border guards 7 times.
하지만 국경 수비대는 나를 검사해서 이렇게 여러 가지를 이렇게 검사를 하는 게 아니라 나한테 가장 처음에 물어보는 게 먹을 게 있나, 담배 좀 있나, 돈이 좀 있나 이것부터 저한테 요구를 하는 거예요.
But the first thing they did each time was not searching my body, but asking me whether I had food, cigarettes, or money. 제가 또
대담하게 이 국경 수비대한테 저 건너에 있는 중국 땅을 한번 갔다 와도 되냐 또 그렇게 해도 된답니다.
And I was being very bold to ask the guard whether I can cross the border and go to China and come back. And they said yes.
넘어갔다 올 때 그냥 담배만 중국 담배 조금 좀 사다 달라고 그렇게 부탁도 하고요.
And they even asked me to come back with some packs of Chinese cigarettes.
북한에는 법이 있지만은 그 법은 제가 생각으로는 거의 그냥 제 기능을 못 한다고 저는 생각을 하고 있습니다. 하도 이 북한 정권 자체가 제 기능을 못 하고 많은 사람들이 굶어 죽고 있으니까.
I think law is dysfunctional in North Korea because the regime itself is dysfunctional.
오직 북한 정권을 지탱하고 있는 힘은 이 공포밖에 없다고 저는 생각을 하고 있어요.
I think the only thing that supports that sustains the regime itself is the rule of fear.
조금만 정치적인 발언을 잘못한다고 해서 갖다 잡아 죽이고 뭐 김정일, 김정은 욕한다고 해서 가차없이 갖다 온 가족을 다 멸살시키기 때문에 우리 북한 사람들은 이걸 굉장히 공포스럽게 생각을 하고 있고 자기가 하고 싶은 얘기도 못하고 살고 있죠.
People cannot say what they want to do or do what they want to do because even when you make even the slightest mistake or that against the regime, not only you but your whole family are taken to prison camps.
북한에서의 법은 오직 김정일이가 한 말 그 자체가 법인 거예요.
The only law that can exist in North Korea is order from Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un now.
저는 이게 법이라고 생각하지는 않습니다, 절대로.
I don't think such thing can be a law in a country.
I mean, just to follow up on that, though, did you ever get any sense of from the guards in the camp that there was some kind of empathy, that they had some consideration to your position, or did you think that the guards had bought in totally to this idea that you were all prisoners and had to be treated badly?
In the prison camp.
In the prison camp, did they all believe the propaganda that these were prisoners, or did some show some sympathy?
수용소에서 수용소 간수들이 모두 다 그 북한 정권의 그 룰을 믿고 있었는지 아니면 그와 같은 간수 교수들한테도 좀 동정심을 보여줬어요.
일단 수용소 안에서의 그 간수들 상태는 저는 전혀 알 수가 없어요. 제가 또 알아서도 안 되고 또 알려고 해서도 안 되고요.
I don't know much about the way they think, the way the prison guards in prison camps think, and I'm not supposed to know that either.
또 그들은 철저하게 우리를 감시하고 철저하게 우리를 억압하고 있기 때문에 우리는 그들을 굉장히 무서워하고 또 그들이 가르쳐주는 거 외에 절대로 알 수 있는 방법이 전혀 없습니다.
Their job is to monitor us and oppress us, and we are supposed to do whatever they tell us to do, and we are not supposed to know what's going on in their mind.
동정심 같은.
물론 이제 저도 이제 그때 당시 살 때는 이 간수들이 인간인지 정말 짐승인지 이렇게 구분을 못했었는데 이제 한국에 와서 그때 당시 상황을 뭐 여러 가지 책을 내면서 이렇게 다시 그때 당시 생각을 이렇게 상상을 해보게 되면은 저도 느끼는 게 있거든요.
When I was in prison camp, I didn't know whether they were human beings or animal-like subhuman beings. But after I came to South Korea and rewinded my memories back to my life, back to the time in prison camp, some thoughts occurred to me.
예를 들어서 제가 어머니 사건 때문에 감옥에서 거의 죽어갈 때게 온몸에 상처를 입고 거의 죽어갈 때게 옆에 있는 제 갇힌 감방에 있던 제 동료가 저를 이렇게 치료해 주는 거 간수가 보고 그거를 눈 감아 주기도 하고 오히려 저한테 이렇게 이 끓인 물 같은 것들을 이렇게 갖다 주기도 했었고 이런 적이 있었었고요.
When I was nearly dying from being tortured for 7 months because of the mother and brother incident, a colleague came to look after me because my scars were really bad at the time. And one prison guard saw my colleague looking after me, and he condoned it, and even brought some boiling hot water for me as well.
그리고 내가 감옥에서 나와서 이 아이들한테 내 엄마가 이 공기청이 당해서 죽었다고 아이들이 나를 때리고 못사게 굴고 할 때게 거의 다 죽어갈 때게 이 담당 간수가 애들이 나를 못 때리게 막아주고 또 여러 가지를 이렇게 통해서 이제 나를 이제 많이 좀 이렇게 좀 그렇게 해줬다고 저는 느끼고 있습니다 지금.
And when I was released, my classmates were bullying me for turning my mother and brother in, and I was being harshly beaten by my classmates. And another prison guard saw that and stopped them from beating me further. And I felt, only after I was looking back, I sort of felt that they had sympathy or empathy.
판단은 여러분들이 해주시면 그 사람이 좋은 사람인지 나쁜 사람인지 여러분들이 판단해 주시면 될 거예요.
But whether that person was good or bad, I think it's up to you to decide.
Okay, go ahead.
Firstly, for Mr. Shin, thank you for having the courage and determination to continue to share your story. It's a question for Mr. Shin on what Mr. Harden describes towards the end of the book about your struggle to come to terms with life post the camp. How are you now? Will you ever be at peace, or can you at peace? Are you at peace with yourself at the moment?
제가 거기서 처음에 탈출할 때는 단지 먹는 것 때문에 탈출했었거든요. 이 수용소 밖에만 넘어가게 되면은 자기가 먹고 싶은 음식을 먹을 수 있고 또 놀고 싶을 때, 자고 싶을 때 막 마음대로 잘 수 있다고 하기 때문에 그것 때문에 도망을 쳤었습니다.
The biggest factor that triggered my escape was actually food. The thought of spending one single day with full stomach was the main thing that prompted me to escape.
지금 한국에 와서 그때 제가 그 생각했던 그런 걸 모든 걸 다 잃었어요. 입고 싶은 옷을 입고 먹고 싶은 거 먹고 자고 싶을 때 제 마음대로 자고요.
I achieved pretty much everything that I had hoped for when I came to South Korea. I wear the clothes that I want to wear. I go to bed when I want to go to bed. I eat what I want to eat.
하지만 저는 육체적으로는 너무 편안해졌지만은 정신적으로는 엄청난 고통을 지금 당하고 있습니다.
So I'm much better off physically, but mentally I'm under much more stress.
제가 처음에 말씀드렸듯이 제가 홀로코스트 뮤지엄 가서 영상을 보고 정치범 수용소의 앞날을 생각했다고 말씀드렸죠.
Earlier this evening I mentioned that when I visited the Holocaust Museum, I could see the possible future of prison camps in North Korea.
저는 그렇게 도망쳐가지고 이렇게 편안한 생활을 하고 있는데 아직도 저 정치범 수용소 안에 살고 있는 수많은 사람들은 내가 당했던 고통보다 더 심한 고통을 당하고 있고 또 수많은 사람들이 죽고 있고 그 안에서 나 같은 또 수많은 사람들이 태어나고 있을 거고 제가 이런데 어떻게 정말 편하게 정말 발 뻗고 잘 수 있을까요? 아마 상황을 바꿔놓고 생각해봐도 여러분들도 저랑 같을 거라고 생각을 합니다.
I was lucky enough to have escaped and live in comfort, but there are still so many people suffering in prison camps in North Korea. And when I think about them, I can't go to bed with a peaceful mind. And I'm sure if you were in my shoes, it would be the same.
저는 이렇게 여러분들 앞에서 이런 얘기를 한 번씩 하고 들어가게 되면은 거의 한 일주일 동안을 이렇게 악몽에 시달리고 있어요.
When I give interviews and have a talk like this, I have nightmares for about a week afterwards.
하지만 제가 이렇게라도 하지 않으면은 그들을 도울 수 있는 방법이 전혀 없기 때문입니다.
But I feel that this is the only thing that I can do to help them.
Do you want to say anything about how you changed? Or you want to leave it that way?
I've known Shin since December 2008, and he's come really a long way. And in fact, he seems to have come, he's moved the quickest in the past year, in part because I think he's found something. He's living in Seoul now. He lived in the United States mostly for 2 years, but he went back in 2011, and now he is doing webcasting. He invites someone else, another defector, and there are now 24,000 of them living in South Korea. He invites them on to do a webcast, and his audience is that group of defectors in this well-wired country. And he talks to them, and it's given him several things. I think it's given him a sense of purpose, and I think it's given him a professional it's given him a profession, and it's also given him emotional balance that he didn't have before. And what he often says when asked this question is, you know, it's going slowly, but it's going. And it seems to me, and Shin and I had been apart since he left Seattle last year. He lived in Seattle, where I live. For 8-10 months or something, and it seems to be actually going a little bit faster for him, and which is great.
Great.
Shin mentioned that the only thing he believes in now is God. And I was just wondering what place God might have had in his life in the camps and after, and if he could kind of describe his relationship with that.
수용소에서 살면서 신은 어디 있었는가? 그 이후에는 어떻게 했었는지, 그래서 너의 삶에서의 신은
I don't know if you want to talk about the role of the missionaries in all of this, or maybe not.
이 수용소 안에서의 그런 내가 믿을 수 있는 신, 뭐 내가 물론 뭐 여러 가지 뭐 하나님이나 예수님이나 이런 얘기들에서 전혀 들어본 적이 없었습니다. 거기서 사는 동안.
I wasn't exposed to any of the talks involving God or Jesus when I lived in prison camp.
물론 도망쳐서도 뭐 한동안은 뭐 이런 걸 접해본 적이 없었죠.
And also for some time after I escaped from prison camp.
오히려 제가 중국에서 거의 1년 동안 헤맬 때에 제가 중국에 있는 한국 교회들을 거의 하루 동안 무려 7번을 찾아갔던 적이 있었습니다.
I wandered around China for about a year, and there was one day when I visited 7 different Korean Christian churches in China.
하루 동안 7번을 교회를 찾아갔지만은 저는 그 교회들에서 다 쫓겨났었어요.
But they turned me away, all 7 of them.
이유는 탈북자이기 때문에 중국에서 탈북자를 도와주면은 자기는 처벌받기 때문에 도와줄 수 없다는 거였어요.
Because helping a North Korean escapee would put them at risk under Chinese law.
하지만 그래도 저는 한국에 오게 됐고 또 한국에서 뭐 여러 가지 이유로 정신적인 그런 여러 가지 병 때문에 병원에 한동안 또 입원을 하게 됐었고요.
But despite that experience, I came to South Korea, and of course life wasn't easy at all. Because of severe depression, I had to be hospitalized as well.
하지만 저를 잡아주고 저를 이끌어주고 제가 이 한국 사회에 와서 이 새로운 세상에 와서 제가 나쁜 길로 떨어지지 않고 이렇게 저를 이끌어줬던 거는 교회였었어요. 그래도 교회였었어요.
But also, the environment in South Korea, it could have been really easy for me to go off the track and be tempted to go to the bad track. But it was also the church that prevented me from going the wrong way.
여러분들 잘 아실 겁니다. 이 사회에서 살면서 우리가 얼마나 나쁜 길을 떨어질 수가 있고 우리가 얼마나 타락할 수 있는지에 대해서요.
And you probably know it so well that it's very easy to do wrong things in this world.
네. 그래서 저를 이런 길에 떨어지지 않고 올바르게 잡아준 거에 대해서 너무나도 감사하게 생각을 하죠.
So I feel very grateful that I didn't become one of those who went to the wrong track and keep myself sane.
At the back to the
This is a question about media coverage. I suppose mainly directed at Blaine, but I'd be interested in Mr. Shin's views on this. I mean, Mr. Shin was referring in terms of the history of Holocaust, you know, the Cambodian one, which really the international media had a pretty disgraceful role. It took the Vietnamese to invade until the international media started reporting on the scale of the human rights violations there. That's 3 or 4 years, the Nazi Holocaust. So it's not exactly that the international media is terrific at this stuff, but here's something which is out there, your book's out there. Which media, whose country's media is doing this good, is doing this well, in your experience? And just since we're here in London, what should this is a major international media centre. What are you expecting from them? Could they do a hell of a lot better?
Well, there are some things that are quite possible to do and could be done better. And I think that is to systematically talk to the 23,000 North Koreans living in and around Seoul. It just is difficult. They are, they all come to a place called Hanawan, a resettlement center that the South Korean government is actually very generous and humane in the way that it treats the new arrivals. They come, they get between 6 weeks and 3 months, depending on their needs of medical care, counseling, and introduction to the concepts of banking, credit cards, subways. Basically, they help take them from the Middle Ages to go-go modern Korea. Then they leave, and they get jobs, they get free housing, and they get a stipend. But they're there. They're hanging around in Greater Seoul by the tens of thousands now. And journalists can talk to them, but what the psychiatrists and psychologists say about the newcomers is that virtually all of them are clinically paranoid, which they say is a healthy adaptation to life in North Korea. But it is not a healthy adaptation to being a successful South Korean, and it's certainly not an easy condition to have when Western journalists come to talk to you, because they are evasive, they are scared, they just don't know what the hell to do. And so it takes forever to get interviews, as you know. You've tried it. It is just really, really difficult. And it does not produce a day story. It doesn't produce a week story. Sometimes you don't get anything for a very long time. So, and they're the only people who really know what's going on in North Korea. Everything that the government says is a lie. Every image they portray is a lie. And they almost never allow a single Western journalist to get out of this chamber of false images and false lies, some of which are actually quite seductive to look at. You know, goose-stepping people, cards in stadiums and all this. And even the funny look of the leaders is interesting and amusing, and it passes for journalism. But real journalism, I think, is talking to these 23, 4,000, and 2,000 more the cup is constantly replenished every year with newcomers. So the ore is there to mine for those who have the patience and the stomach for it. I think that's the simple standard. As for who is doing a good job, I think people try, but I don't think that people do the kind of systematic interviews. And what editor in what capital would give a reporter the time to do that? I mean, I did not have the time to really talk to Mr. Shin until I left the Washington Post, and then sat with him in Seoul and in Southern California and in Seattle, and all this time passed, and then I get a fresh story. So it's not so easy. And then as far as the human rights story, though, as a component of what we understand North Korea to be, it seems like that could easily be now put into every story. David Hawk's new Hidden Gulag, it's just full of information that can just fit into so many stories. It's all corroborated by satellite images and by just many, 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 many people saying the same thing over the years. So I guess that's my rambling answer.
I mean, we're running out of time, so I mean, I think we'll just give Mr. Shin the last word. I mean, did he have any thoughts about the media coverage?
그냥 좀 제 바람은 뭐 영국, 미국, 이 세계에 있는 모든 언론들이 그냥 북한에서 살고 있는 그 사람들이 모습 그대로 비춰줬으면 하는 바람입니다.
I hope media all around the world portray the situation in North Korea as it is.
예를 들어서 지금 저 책이 나왔는데 저 책이 나를 위한 관심이 아니라 신문 기사 낼 때에 이 신동엽이가 이렇게 살았고 이렇게 살았다, 이게 도망쳐 나왔다고 이렇게 영웅처럼 이렇게 내는 기사가 아니라 나에 대한 스토리를 통해서 이 수용소 안에서 살고 있는 사람들이 어떻게 참혹하게 지금 생활을 하고 있는지를 좀 비춰줬으면 하는 바람입니다.
The motivation for the book was not self-publicity, not a heroic epic of my journey. And I hope that through that book, media would take interest not in my own story, but what's actually happening in North Korea.
여러분, 제가 좀 전에 저는 처음에 언론인들을 믿지 않았었고 언론인들을 미워했었다고 말씀드렸었잖아요.
Earlier today, I said that I used to hate journalists and not trust them.
제가 오늘 이 자리에 와서 다시 새롭게 생각했던 게 있습니다.
New thoughts occurred to me while I was sitting here in front of you.
아까 제가 이 아래층에서 잠깐 쉬면서 어떤 유품 앞에서 한참 서서 구경했던 적이 있거든요.
While I was hanging out downstairs in the bar area, I saw a display of relics of journalists.
제가 봤던 그 유품이 여러분들이 잘 알고 있는 그 코소보나 이런 학살 현장에 가서 그에 대한 참상을 전하려고 나가서 그 취재를 하다가 죽은 사람들이 유품이었었어요. 총에 맞아 죽은 사람들이 유품입니다.
Those artifacts were from journalists who were covering the Balkans and the Kosovo genocide.
저는 그 유품을 보면서 제가 이렇게 미워했던 기자들에 대해서 정말 미안하게 생각을 합니다.
And looking at the display, I felt very sorry for having disliked journalists so much.
북한 정권이 일방적으로 보여주고 있는 그것만 내보내주는 게 아니라 정말로 그 안에서 살고 있는 사람들의 모습, 그걸 정말로 이 전 세계 사람들한테 보여줬으면 하는 바람.
I hope the journalists all over the world don't just show the material that comes out of the North Korean regime, but actually the things that are actually happening in North Korea.
Sadly, that's the end. We've done our hour and a half. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Mr. Shin. Thank you, Blaine. It is a very interesting book. It greatly improves our knowledge about what's going on in North Korea, and I commend it.